So now let's talk about the interaction channels and the sharing model design considerations for those interaction channels. So I'm in the schema builder and I need to get back into setup in order to search. And so I'm going to click the setup icon to go to the setup menu, and we're going to search for sharing. And if you remember, under sharing settings is where you find the org-wide defaults for your organization and also your sharing rules that you can set. It's all underneath this one page. And you can select sharing settings for an individual object instead of it listing all. But with all, you can see the different organization-wide defaults, both default internal and external access. And then if granting access is being used using hierarchies as well. And then if you scroll down, here you have the other settings, and this varies over time. There used to be more settings here, but the main point of all this is not to try and memorize all this or get concerned if there's a new checkbox since I recorded this that you're seeing and I'm not seeing. You've not missed anything. Salesforce is just always making changes to what's available here. And then the individual sharing rules by object. And so we want to talk about the sharing model design. And when we talk about the sharing model, you have as your baseline foundation, or at the very base, is the most restrictive access is set at the org-wide default. And then you open up access and broaden the door of access basically as you create sharing settings and sharing rules down below. And so if you notice, some of these objects are set to private, such as live chat transcript, live agent session. Other things are set to public, read, write, and transfer. Certain objects allow for you to transfer them to other people. One of those would be cases. Likely the other would be leads. And let me scroll up, and there it is. Yes. So leads and cases are two objects that lend themselves to someone working it and then needing the ability to transfer that to someone else. And so if we go in and click edit, for example, we can change these defaults to these other options. And for case, for example, there's private, which is the most restrictive. I'm not going to do that, but that warning that it gives, let me go back to it to show you the warning for private. When the case sharing model is private, each case queue must have at least one member. If you're using case queues, please confirm in cases setup that each queue has members. We'll be setting up queues here pretty soon in this course. And queues allow groups of people to work cases or to pull cases out of a queue and take ownership and work those. And so I'm going to close that out though and show you that other options are public read only, public read write, and then for cases, public read write and transfer. So that one potential thing that could trip you up on the exam is they may ask you about, what are the different options you can set on the org-wide defaults for cases. Just bear in mind that rather than these traditional three at the top, there's a fourth one as well that encompasses the ability to transfer beyond the public read-write. If we were to want to set cases to private or the most restrictive possible, then what we would need to do for design considerations as it relates to the sharing model is we could then open up some different rules to open up cases based on certain criteria. And so I'm going to go ahead and click Save and click OK. And I've now setting my case org-wide default to private. And this is something that typically isn't done, but I wanted to show you though quickly objects that we deal with in the Service Cloud. So if I click New for case sharing rules, you need to give this sharing rule a name and be descriptive with it in the description. And then you select your rule criteria, your rule type. You can have the rule based on the owner. And these are the different steps as far as any cases that are owned by public groups. And there's a couple of different public groups here that I have in my instance, or by roles. And this way you could select records that are owned by anyone in like the marketing team role, for example. And then you select the users to share that with. You could share with public groups, roles, or roles and subordinates. And then as well, just to note, this is a type of question that is inevitably on the admin exam, and it'll likely show up on the Service Cloud exam as well, is as it relates to sharing settings, who can you share records with, or what sort of case ownership designations can you set the criteria to. It may be really worded, real obtuse, Don't get thrown off. The main things to keep in mind with these sharing settings are either public groups, roles, or roles and subordinates. Now, roles and subordinates would be people that are in a role or anyone below them in the role hierarchy. And so for marketing team, if there was like a junior marketing team below the marketing team, there's not in this instance, but if there were, then the records that would be shared would be any cases owned by the marketing team or the junior marketing team, and they'd be shared with people in, let's say, the channel sales team. I'm just throwing things out there off the top of my head. Don't worry about specifics here, just the mechanics of knowing what these options are going to be important, and understanding why is that we've set our case object to private, and now we need to grant access based on cases that are owned by these roles and subordinates and sharing them with people that are in this role. And then we can open that up with different levels of access. We could give them read-only access or read-write access, meaning they can edit these cases or create new ones. And so I'm just going to say read-only and click Save and click OK. And anytime you make settings to the org-wide defaults or create sharing settings, Salesforce goes in and recalculates everything, and you can actually manually force a recalculation by clicking the recalculate button, and that will go through and set the access rights on a record-by-record basis. And sometimes it takes a while, and it's a process that runs, but then once it's run and it's through, then all the records or all the cases in this example would respect the current rules. And so then in addition, another case sharing rule we could create, we could do, instead of selecting a rule type of based on record owner, is based on criteria. And here's where you can select which records to share based on certain values in the fields on the case. So if, for example, case origin equals email, for example, let's call this sharing rule email case sharing. Let's just say any email cases we want to go ahead and open up to all internal users. And so in essence, what we're doing here, especially if we set this to read-write, is even though we have set the case object org-wide defaults to private, we're opening this up wide to all internal users if it is a case that originated via email. So hopefully you can see the power of these sharing settings that you can specify either by criteria or by ownership. So now you see this notice here, and this is what I was talking about earlier, saying one or more sharing operations has been initiated. See below for additional details. Certain operations may not be available. And so we've got our case sharing rules. The sharing rule operation is currently in progress. The initiating user will receive an email when the operation finishes. Now, cases connect with a few other objects. And so since we've opened up cases to all internal users for the email cases, that has an impact then on the corresponding accounts that those cases belong to. And then there's some sharing settings that will be impacted on the opportunity object because opportunities connect with accounts as well. And so you don't make these changes to sharing settings lightly. You have to really test these things out in a sandbox environment, which is like a development type of environment that you can test out the impact of the changes you make, because there are unintended consequences as you remove access or grant additional access through these sharing settings. It may cause Apex triggers to no longer work, or processes to no longer work, and different automations. And an example of that would be if you took access to a certain field away to a certain profile, and then they go to save a case, and then you've got some sort of workflow rule or process or trigger set to fire based on that, or looking for that field, and that user doesn't have access to that field, then it could cause bad things to happen. So I don't want you to think that it's best practice to just willy-nilly make changes to these org-wide defaults and sharing settings, but I wanted to quickly be able to get into the details of the interaction channels and the sharing model design considerations. And just as a reminder, that those interaction channels have to do with the different ways that a case can be created in Salesforce, which we've created the different case record types, and we've now done a lot around the org-wide defaults and the sharing settings on cases. Now I'm going to refresh my screen to see if this operation is done. Since I'm recording a lecture, I tend to try to not check my email because that's where I go in order to lose all sorts of time, because there's always some sort of email lurking that requires attention. So the best way to not lose time is ignore my emails. So the process is now done, the warning is gone, and we see cases is set to private. We see our different sharing settings that we've set, or our sharing rules. And so we can delete one of these. For example, I'm going to go ahead and delete the case origin equals email for all internal users and remove that and click OK. The screen eventually refreshes as it updates all the records. And then I'm going to go ahead and change the default access on cases to public read write again, and also transfer. And the reason I'm doing that is I want to avoid wreaking havoc in subsequent lectures as I try to do other things in the Service Cloud. And so let's click Save and click OK, so that we've opened up the org-wide defaults to cases to public read write transfer. So since it is wide open now, we really don't need this other case sharing rule. So something to bear in mind is that a lot of times as you change org-wide defaults, you'll want to revisit your sharing rules and see if they're necessary any longer or not. Some instances you may still need them. Other times it's good to go ahead and delete them so that you can avoid confusion down the road. And it's always best to just clean things up as you're doing things rather than thinking, oh, I'll get to that later, because inevitably you won't. So in the next lecture, we're going to discuss the interaction channels and the reporting design considerations for them.